Hey everyone, just wanted to take this opportunity to say thank you so much for listening. If you're enjoying this podcast, we would really appreciate it if you left us a review and shared these episodes with a friend. We really appreciate your support in helping us to grow this podcast. And with that, let's get started with this week's episode. George Washington is remembered as the first president of the United States, the leader of the Continental Army, the hero of the American Revolution, and the father of his country. But he came very close to never having the chance to become any of those things. Today's story is going to focus on a particular event in Washington's early military career, in which we can clearly see Divine Providence at work in Washington's life. At the young age of 23, Washington was a young man full of ambition and virtue who desired to serve his country of Britain honorably. And this dedication to service nearly cost him his life. This is the story of a coat full of holes, Washington's close call. George Washington was sick, very sick. For about 3 weeks now, his body had been racked with high fever, intense headaches, and what we'll call intense digestive issues. Some days had been worse than others, confining him to his cot when they made camp or the back of a covered wagon when the army was on the march. He rode his horse when he could, but many days he was too weak to even stand. He had expected to battle the French on this expedition rather than dysentery, but this was unfortunately the hand that he had been dealt. It was late June 1755, and the French and Indian War was in the midst of its second year. 23-year-old George Washington had been present during the first shots of this war the previous year, and had in fact overseen and ordered those first shots to be fired. The French had decided to construct a fort in British-claimed territory, calling it Fort Duquesne, which was located in modern-day Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. George Washington, a lieutenant colonel at the time and a loyal British subject, had been sent by the governor of Virginia to warn the French to leave the fort, and, for that matter, the Ohio River Valley. Washington had led a group of about 40 members of the Virginia militia, along with a group of Iroquois Indian allies, in an ambush of French forces about 50 miles southeast of Fort Duquesne. This had been a victory, but it provoked an intense response from the French in the area. Washington had constructed a small fort, calling it Fort Necessity, to resist the French, but he was forced to surrender it soon after in a humiliating defeat on July 4th, 1754. This is how the French and Indian War, a regional conflict in a worldwide war known as the 7 Years' War, began. It had been Washington's first campaign as an officer, and it had been a disaster. Since that defeat, he had also come to the realization that as a colonial officer, he would never be treated as an equal to officers in the British regular army, no matter what he did. As a colonial, he was expected to take orders from officers in the British regular army of even lower rank than he. The defeat at Fort Necessity had been a tough pill to swallow, but the unequal treatment he was receiving as a colonial was a bridge too far. Although he had achieved the rank of lieutenant colonel in the colonial forces, he officially resigned his command of the Virginia Regiment on October 31st, 1754. The following year, a campaign was organized by the famed British general Edward Braddock, again with the goal of taking control of Fort Duquesne and the Ohio River Valley. George Washington had signed on to this expedition as a volunteer and was made an aide-de-camp to General Braddock. Over 2,000 British troops and colonial militia joined this march, and they attempted to cut their way through the wilderness en route to Fort Duquesne in the summer of 1755. That is when the dysentery struck Washington. Here Washington now lay at a place they call Bear Camp, fighting against what at that time was a life-threatening disease while Braddock and his men pressed on ahead toward Fort Duquesne. It had been slow going these past several weeks, and they had not covered nearly as much ground as they had hoped. Braddock had thus decided to take about half of his force on ahead, believing he could move much more quickly with fewer numbers. Washington wanted so badly to be with them, and he was determined not to let this illness keep him from the action. He had beaten severe illness before. Just 4 years prior, he had contracted a severe case of smallpox, which had confined him to his bed for weeks. But he had lived to tell the tale. Rising from his cot, he began to ready himself for his journey. He would have to ride hard and ride fast to catch up with Braddock's troops in time, and it wouldn't be easy in his condition. But he believed he was up to the task. Fort Duquesne was waiting, and he had unfinished business there. For 10 days, he rode as quickly as his body would allow, and he finally rejoined Braddock's column on July 8th. He was exhausted and in intense pain, but he was exactly where he wanted to be. Braddock, he knew, had much to teach as a commander in the British regular army, and Washington wanted to learn as much as he could about military leadership from such a man. They were nearing Fort Duquesne now. It was very reasonable to assume that perhaps within 24 hours they would be able to cross the threshold of Duquesne, celebrating a grand victory. That assumption, however, would be very, very wrong. The morning of July 9th began easily enough. Braddock's men pressed forward through the wilderness, making it to the Monongahela River. Crossing the river, they soon found themselves within 10 miles of Fort Duquesne. Anticipation was high, and despite Washington's weakened state, he dutifully pressed on. Then he heard it. Shots and explosions rang out from the column ahead. Shouts, cries of pain, explosions, and lead quickly filled the air. But where was the enemy? The British troops shot wildly into the forest at an enemy they couldn't see, an enemy consisting of approximately 900 French and Indian troops. For a time, the British reacted in the way they had been trained. They formed lines and fired volleys in the supposed direction of their hidden enemy. Unlike the French and Indians, though, the British were standing and firing in the open, which was common in the warfare of Europe at the time. But they weren't in Europe anymore. Confusion and fear soon took hold, and the British at the front of the column began retreating from their position in sheer panic. General Braddock, who had been a bit farther back from the action, gathered a force of troops and raced toward the front. This group soon ran headlong into the retreating soldiers, further adding to the chaos. Despite the insanity that swirled around him, George Washington forgot his illness and sprang into action. He raced his horse along the column of British troops, urging them to form lines and stand their ground as he delivered messages and orders throughout the confused rabble. Washington knew he was a much more visible target on horseback, but he also knew that speed was essential in this moment in order to fulfill his orders and rally the men. He raced on through the fog of war when suddenly he found himself tumbling to the ground. His horse had been shot. Unshaken, he jumped to his feet and ran on, commandeering the next available horse he could find. He carried on as before. Sweat poured from his brow as smoke filled the air and stung his eyes. These men were getting slaughtered, and he had to do his part to limit any further slaughter. His fellow Virginians began taking cover and firing from their defensive positions, even as the British regulars continued to fire from the open in tightly packed groups. He had to find Braddock. All at once, he was once again careening toward the earth. His second horse had also just been shot. How long until the enemy's fire would claim his life instead of that of his mount? There was no time to think of that. Where was Braddock? Washington pressed on, with the dead and dying piling up on every side. At last, he found General Braddock. The general had been hit, and it didn't look good. Blood poured from a wound in Braddock's chest and arm as he lay where he had fallen from his horse. Washington assisted others nearby in quickly unfolding Braddock's sash, placing the general upon it, and carrying him away from the massacre unfolding around them. Upon getting the general away from the battlefield, Washington returned to organize a retreat. With the vast majority of the British officers either killed or wounded, it fell to Washington as one of Braddock's closest aides to lead these efforts. Musket balls continued to whiz by at a merciless rate. At times it seemed impossible that Washington could avoid being hit. But he continued to organize the men as best he could, pushing them to retreat to safety even as he helped carry more wounded officers away from the fray. Upon reaching the Monongahela River once again, Washington oversaw the organization of a formation of troops which covered the rest of the British as they escaped across the river and into relative safety. Finally, after about 3 hours of fighting, which had seemed more like 3 years, the firing ceased and the battle was over. Making his way into camp, Washington's weariness swarmed over him, and he removed his coat. This was the same blue coat he had worn in his time as a lieutenant colonel with the Virginia militia, and was no stranger to action. What he saw in examining his trusty coat, though, shook him to his core. There in his coat were 4 distinct holes, each about the size of a musket ball. 4 shots meant for him. 4 shots meant to take his life. 4 shots that seemingly should have hit their mark. Yet they hadn't. Upon examining his body, he found not a single wound or mark of any kind indicating that he had been struck by any of these shots. How could this be? He should at least be wounded, if not dead, yet here he stood. He was overcome with exhaustion and pain from his lingering illness, but otherwise completely unharmed. He lifted his eyes to the sky. This was a miracle, and he knew who was responsible. 9 days later, on July 18th, Washington sat in Fort Cumberland in Maryland, where Braddock's campaign had begun weeks before. General Braddock was dead. He had succumbed to his wounds 5 days before on July 13th. As Braddock had requested, Washington had overseen the general's burial. He chose to bury the general in the middle of the road, where the marching of British troops would wipe away every trace of his burial place. The last thing they wanted was for the French or enemy Native Americans to discover that the general had passed before the British could reach the safety of Fort Cumberland. Upon reaching the fort, Washington had found that news of Braddock's death had preceded his arrival. He also heard the rumor of his own death, and even of his supposed last words. How nearly accurate that rumor was. George feared that these rumors of his death would reach his family, so he felt it necessary to write a letter to his brother, John, weary though he was. Sitting down in his quarters, Washington put pen to paper and wrote the following. To Mr. John Augustine Washington. Dear brother, as I have heard since my arrival at this place a circumstantial account of my death and dying speech, I take this early opportunity of contradicting the first, and of assuring you that I have not, as yet, composed the latter. But by the all-powerful dispensations of Providence, I have been protected beyond all human probability and expectation. For I had 4 bullets through my coat, and 2 horses shot under me. Yet, although death was leveling my companions on every side of me, escaped unhurt. We have been most scandalously beaten by a trifling body of men, but fatigue and the want of time will prevent me from giving you any of the details until I have the happiness of seeing you at Mount Vernon, which I now most ardently wish for, since we are drove in thus far. A weak and feeble state of health obliges me to halt here for 2 or 3 days, to recover a little strength, that I may thereby be enabled to proceed homewards with more ease. You may expect to see me there on Saturday or Sunday se'night, which is as soon as I can well be down, as I shall take my bullskin plantations on my way. Pray give my compliments to all my friends. I am, dear Jack, your most affectionate brother, G.W. George Washington's survival at the Battle of the Monongahela is nothing short of a miracle. Even though his coat had been riddled with bullet holes and he had 2 horses shot out from under him, he still managed to avoid any kind of wound. The fact that he also managed to make it through this battle, despite his battle with dysentery, is also remarkable. This is perhaps not the end of this amazing story, though. In a story recounted by Washington's step-grandson, George Washington Parke Custis, years later, in 1770, George Washington was traveling in the area of modern-day West Virginia with his physician, James Craik. It was there, according to Custis and Craik, that Washington encountered an Indian leader who had fought against the British at the Battle of the Monongahela. This Indian chief informed Washington that during the battle, he and his fellow warriors had fired their rifles at Washington many times without hitting their mark. He expressed his amazement that Washington had survived and claimed that a mighty power shielded him. Custis's account further said that the Indian leader had predicted that Washington would, quote, become the chief of nations, and a people yet unborn will hail him as the founder of a mighty empire. Historians today tend to place this encounter with the Native American leader to be more in the realm of myth than fact. But the popularity of this story in the early 1800s still demonstrates that Americans of the earliest years of the American Republic believed that the survival of Washington in this battle was a work of divine providence and worthy to be remembered. Washington's reaction to the battle also demonstrates his understanding that God had graciously protected him. In the aftermath of the battle, rather than arrogantly proclaiming that his bravery and valor had carried him through the fog of war, he gave all credit to Providence for his survival. He was not alone in this. The aforementioned Dr. James Craik had also been present at the battle, and despite the chaos, he had witnessed Washington's actions firsthand. Recounting what he had observed, Craik stated that, quote, I expected every moment to see him fall. His duty and situation exposed him to every danger. Nothing but the superintending care of Providence could have saved him from the fate of all around him. Think how different everything in the years following would have been had any of those musket balls fired at Washington have caused his death. It is likely that the American Revolutionary War 20 years later would not have been won. The Constitution would not have been created, and the United States of America would not have been formed as we understand it today. In effect, the entire world itself would be drastically different as a result. But Providence ordained that Washington survived, and he was protected throughout the entire ordeal and beyond. Washington himself, along with his close friends and many early Americans, thus understood that the affairs of men are governed by the providence of Almighty God. It drove Washington to humility rather than arrogance, and it demonstrates a lesson that Americans today would do well to remember. America is a blessed nation, We have been blessed to survive as a nation under a single constitution for 250 years. This, like Washington's survival, is due to the grace of God. We do well to remember this, rather than arrogantly assuming that our existence as a nation is due to our strength, our bravery, our wealth, or any other human trait. May we, like George Washington, humble ourselves and give credit where it's due. May we glorify God for His goodness in preserving us these 250 years. And may we repent of where we have gone astray. And may we, with a firm reliance on the protection of Divine Providence, continue to rely on Him for our existence, our sustenance, and our future preservation. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.